On Thursday night at 11:59, just a few hours from now, a public health law limiting immigration is set to expire. Now, you might know it as Title 42. It's creating a lot of conversation online as we get into the final hours of a Trump era pandemic rule. Here to talk with us about that is Georgia attorney and Emory University law professor Charles Kuck. Charles, thank you so much for joining us here on Atlanta News First. I know that this is an area of expertise for you, and we really appreciate you coming on here to discuss this with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always good to talk about the law.
Always good to talk about the law. So this is creating obviously a lot of conversation online. We're seeing a lot of conversation among Americans here who are talking about Title 42 and, as we'll get into here shortly, Title 8. But I want to really break down what that means for those that might not be totally looped in. What is set to happen at midnight, and what is Title 42?
Title 42 is a public health law that's operated by the Centers for Disease Control that allows the director of the Centers for Disease Control to limit who comes into the United States because of a public health problem. Many presidents, many directors of the CDC have actually used this in the past. Most recently and most famously, President Obama actually had a Title 42 barrier for people coming from East Africa back in the teens when an Ebola outbreak occurred. The Trump administration, however, used Title 42 very differently. Several months after the COVID crisis occurred, they decided to use Title 42 only on our southern border to allow Customs and Border Protection, that's the Border Patrol, to basically send people back to Mexico without allowing them to process a claim and without deporting them. It's a rather unique set of circumstances. And what that meant was that people who would normally have, if they came illegally and got caught by the Border Patrol, would have been deported to their home countries, were simply just turned around and said, go back to Mexico, go grab a taco. And then they came back the next day. And Title 42 became a revolving door for people trying to get into the United States. The Biden administration has tried for 2 years to end Title 42 and return to regular immigration law, kind of like returning to regular programming in television. But they've been barred from doing that because of lawsuits by Republicans, mostly in Texas. But finally, the lawsuits are over. The law will end this evening, and we'll go back to immigration law the way Congress meant it to be done.
And I think there's a lot of misconception out there about what Title 42 exactly is going to do, and you touched upon that just now. A lot of people saying this is just going to open our borders wide open. That's not necessarily the case. Is that correct?
Well, it's actually the opposite. Ending Title 42 allows the borders to close. It allows the Border Patrol and ICE to deport people to their home countries after processing them under current immigration law. Title 42 was never meant as an enforcement mechanism on a border. It simply never was. It was designed to protect U.S. public health. The immigration laws themselves are designed for enforcement at the border. So when we go back to Title 8, which you referenced earlier, which is immigration law, an individual who is caught entering the country illegally can be processed for what's called expedited removal, which means they can be deported immediately back to their home country without going to a judge, without being released. And the only exception to that expedited removal is if somebody says, I'm afraid to go back to my home country. Now, that does not trigger an automatic release. When somebody says, I'm afraid to go back to my home country, what that does trigger under immigration law is a brief interview by an asylum officer to determine whether or not that person's fear is both reasonable and protected. This interview is called a credible fear interview. If that person does not pass credible fear, they get deported.
And
one of the downsides to Title 42 was ultimately nobody got deported to their home country. They just went back to Mexico and came back over and over again. Some records shows at least several folks, 70 different times they were sent back to Mexico and came back to the US. This time, because they only went back to Mexico, nobody knew. Everybody thought, oh, you can get into America. But once people get deported to their home country, back to Peru, Colombia, Chile, Nigeria, hey, don't go to America, you're getting deported, the numbers will drastically decrease because now enforcement is in place once again.
And walk me through this journey from an immigrant standpoint that is trying to cross over, that is, claiming that they are an asylum seeker and trying to meet the eligibility requirements that are set in place by Title VIII. What are the steps for, let's say, from them to immigrating into the U.S. and then settling in?
Well, to immigrate to the United States, we have a whole legal system. The asylum system is an exception to that process created after World War II because nobody wanted a repeat of what happened in Nazi Germany. So we created the asylum system. Now, the way our Congress wrote immigration law on asylum in 1980, they said this: anybody who's physically in the United States or who shows up at a port of entry or who is caught illegally inside the United States has a right to apply for asylum. That's what our law says. It's not a law created by Biden. It's just the law. And every president, including Trump, were all required to abide by that law. The Trump administration and the Biden administration ignored that law during COVID and under Title 42 sent people back. Many folks said that was probably illegal, and at least one court said it was. But that's gone now because COVID's over, right? At least that's the way the government seems to act about it. So that's gone. That the right to use Title 42 is over. So now we revert back to this law under Title 8, Section 208 of the law says you can apply for asylum. So what you do if you're a foreign national and you get picked up in the desert or you walk up to a port of entry and they say, do you have a visa? And you say, no. Then we're going to deport you. Here we begin fingerprint you, begin the process. And then they say, you're asked the question, are you afraid to go back home? If you say yes, you will be, the rule now is the Biden administration has new rules in place. If you say yes, the next question is, did you apply for asylum in Mexico or any of the other countries you passed through? If you didn't, then you're not getting asylum. You're just going to be deported. You don't get credible fear, you get deported. You are also being detained. Now, there's obviously a limited number of detention beds, but ICE and CBP have over 35,000 spaces to hold people. As of yesterday, they had about 20,000 people in custody. They're going to start detaining people. And then they're going to start booking airplane flights and deporting people back home. That message, when that gets back over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, means you will see a substantial reduction in people coming to the border. Because what most people don't understand is what asylum actually is. Asylum is not, I don't like the president of my country. Asylum is not, there's crime in my country. Asylum is not, I'm being extorted because I have a business. None of those things are asylum. Asylum is a fear of persecution by the government or an actor the government can't control because of your race or your religion or your sexual orientation or your political opinion. It's a very narrow form of relief, and that's why most people are denied asylum. The big problem that was created by the Trump administration, inheriting a rather smaller problem from Obama, is that the volume of cases that were brought in, did not match the capacity of the government to process them. They needed more bodies. They needed more money. And Trump actually reduced the number of people doing asylum cases, and Congress has yet to fund an increase in asylum officers. So it's not a question of us not being able to handle it. It's us not wanting to handle it in a timely manner. This is a completely solvable and crisis, something we can easily handle if we just put our attention on it for a little while. This is not something that's going to ruin America. This actually is probably our chance for a shining moment. Let's show the world how we handle people who are seeking asylum justly, efficiently, quickly. We can do that as a country. The only question is whether there's a political will to do that, or one party wants to use it as a political weapon against another party. We'll see.
And we're talking with Charles Kuck. He's South Georgia, I should say, immigration attorney and a law professor at Emory University. Let's talk a little bit about the local impacts here from a legal standpoint. Georgia is among those states that are going to be bracing for an increase of migrants as Title 8 takes place, as Title 42 expires. As a lawyer yourself, as an immigration lawyer, how is your office preparing? What are the local impacts we can expect to see?
Well, keep in mind, this is not new. What's happening, you're going to see a fewer increased numbers for a short period of time because we've been sending a lot of people back over the last month or so. So there's an increase in numbers briefly. But we've been getting people from the border for the last 5 years. This is nothing new. And Georgia's been receiving immigrants in mass since 1993, since they wanted to build up for the Olympics. This is nothing that Georgia itself can't handle as a state. Our agencies here can handle it. Our courts here can handle it. But in many ways, this presents an opportunity for Georgia employers and for the government. And we have a lot of open jobs in Georgia, a lot of open jobs. And if somebody passes credible fear and says, I'm going to relocate to Georgia because I have family there, once they file for asylum, once they're released after their credible fear interview, they'll be able to get a work permit while their asylum case is pending in court. They'll be able to fill some of these jobs that employers have been dying to fill for the last 3 years. So in some ways, this is a big opportunity for Georgia and should be looked at it as such instead of a crisis of some kind. This is a time for Georgia's light to shine. And I think we're going to do it.
And I know you come from the world of legal, and we appreciate your expertise in that. And I want to ask, for so many people that are looking at this and looking at our economy and some of the problems that we're facing, not just as states, but as a country as a whole, who are saying this is just not the ideal time for Title 42 to expire, for Title 8 to come on. What do you say to those people?
Well, why isn't it? When is a good time for Title 42 to expire? I mean, Title 42 is based on COVID. Is COVID a problem? Then Title 42 is over. It's funny because Republicans have been screaming at Biden to get rid of COVID restrictions. Well, COVID restrictions are based on Title 42. It's the whole thing. You can't get one without the other. Now, if Congress wants to change the law and say we're going to abandon our international refugee treaty obligations, they can do that. I think that's kind of stupid and self-serving. But at the other part of the spectrum is what's wrong with our economy? We have lots of jobs. The basic minimum wage has increased dramatically in the last several years. Inflation's coming down. When is a good time? When is it a good time to welcome the stranger? When is a good time to welcome refugees? Maybe there's never a good time, but it also tests the mettle of the people. When will we open our doors? When will we say, we can help you? I think Georgia's fully prepared for this. I do not see us having negative consequences about this unless politicians make it that. Politicians could also make this a unique opportunity for Georgia, and hopefully they will do that.
And we're talking with immigration attorney, Emory University law professor Charles Kuck. Any final thoughts, any next steps in the legal world that we can anticipate from this?
Well, you bring up a really good point. This would not be necessary. There would not really be a refugee crisis at our border if we fixed our legal immigration system. I just got off the phone with an employer that said, look, I need to hire like 10 people right now to put fences up. I've got so much work to put fences around people's houses. I need to bring people from Mexico. And I said, yeah, well, sorry. There's no visa for that. Nothing I can do. There's nothing exists to solve your problem as an employer. Have Congress call your congressman and say, not stop people at the border. How about, hey, why don't you fix the immigration laws so we don't have people banging down our doors? Most of these folks who will be denied asylum, and most of them will be, are coming for a better life. Well, we have the opportunity to offer a better life. We can. And we can absorb those people. Lazy people don't walk across the Darien Gap. These are the kind of people that want to be Americans. They're screaming to be Americans. Okay, let's see what we can do. But both political parties are terrible at this. They're just terrible at it. They both use it as a bludgeon. Call your congressman, call your senator and say, fix legal immigration. That's my final thought.
Charles, thank you so much for your expertise, for your time here with us today. I want to mention we have continuous coverage on this, on Title 42, on the Atlanta News First app and atlantanewsfirst.com. And you can expect us to follow all of these developments, especially as we near midnight here in Georgia on Atlanta News First, starting with our 3 o'clock newscast. Make sure you tune in.